You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 647 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. That song you're hearing right now is, of course, Leave the Lights On from our good friends in Passafire. You can check those guys out anywhere you get your music. And today, going to do what I believe will probably be a bit of a polarizing episode. We are going to discuss the concept of Jacob Trouba eventually being traded by the New York Rangers. And obviously, he has a full no-move clause, so it's not something that appeared to be possible coming into this offseason, and obviously nothing happened there. But you know, when I look at Cap Friendly and I look at the Ranger roster and the different salaries that all these players are making, his does stand out a little bit. I'm going to discuss why in just a second here. He does have the full no move, but it becomes a limited no move in 2 years. And I'm just kind of openly pondering in today's episode, will Jacob Trouba sooner or later eventually be traded by the New York Rangers for the most important reason of potentially opening up some cap space. We're going to discuss that. We will also continue our off-season series of Draft Spotlight, where we basically just spend some time highlighting every single member of the Rangers draft class of 2022, and we're going to continue that series today with Bryce McConnell-Barker, whom the Rangers selected in the third round of this past year's draft. Now, like I said, we're going to start with Jacob Trouba. That's going to be kind of the meat and potatoes for today's episode. Will Trouba eventually be traded by the Rangers? And once again, mostly as a way to clear some cap space. And in a word, yes, I do eventually think that this probably will happen. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, though, once again, let's just kind of recap where we're at with Jacob Trouba, how he came to the Rangers, all that good stuff. He was acquired in a trade with the Winnipeg Jets. This sent Neil Pionk as well as a first-round draft pick to Winnipeg in exchange for Jacob Trouba. As soon as the Rangers had Trouba, they came to an agreement on an extension, a 7-year, $56 million contract, which carries an annual cap hit of $8 million. Jacob Trouba going into this season, it will be his fourth season of the 7-year contract. And once again, and very importantly, Jacob Trouba does indeed have a full no-move clause heading into this upcoming season and heading into next season as well. The reason I bring up this concept as far as trading Jacob Trouba, I mean, there's a couple reasons, but mainly because the Rangers, as we discussed in here, are really tight up against the salary cap. They have a lot of promising young players that eventually are going to have to get pretty significant raises, and that's not going to be easy to do. I would say sooner or later, maybe after this upcoming season, we're going to get into the territory where, you know, the Rangers, they really have some very difficult decisions to make and might end up having to trade certain players just to open up some cap space. And Jacob Trouba, like I was talking about, I think could be a prime example or a prime candidate to be traded in such a situation. But again, he does have the full no-move clause. And, you know, you look at the Rangers, you know, their current roster and the money that every single player is making. I think when you look up and down it, you see a good amount of relative bargains. You know, you could make the case that just about every single player on this Ranger team is worth either what they're currently being paid, or in some cases, they might be worth more than what they're currently being paid. I mean, you look at Igor Shesterkin, he's at $5.66 million per season. That is a complete steal. I believe he's like the 12th highest paid goalie in hockey, and he just won the Vezina. I would say Ryan Lindgren, you know, he's a great example too. $3 million a season. That is a complete steal for Ryan Lindgren. You know, K'Andre Miller and Braden Schneider, it's a little bit different because they're both on their entry-level contracts, but they're both steals at $925K apiece. Chris Kreider, $6.5 million for 52 goals. That looks like a steal to me. You definitely have to like that contract. Vincent Trocheck, you know, I think that remains to be seen, but I don't see $5.6 million as a gross overpayment for Vincent Trocheck. I know some of you will definitely disagree with me. That's perfectly fine. We'll see how everything plays out with Vincent Trocheck. I know there's going to be some people who will throw out Ryan Reeves at $1.75 million, maybe even Barclay Goodrow at $3.64 million as potential overpays by the Rangers. But if those two players, if either one of them is overpaid, they're not flagrantly overpaid. And honestly, I wouldn't even call either one of them overpaid at all. I know there's some people that are still mad at Artemi Panarin for his performance in the playoffs, but you know what? He's still, to me, one of the best 10 skaters in hockey, fairly easily. $11.64 million a season is obviously a ton of money, but to me, it's the going rate for a superstar player. If you want a true bona fide star on your team, that's pretty much what you're going to have to pay them. And let us never forget that Artemi Panarin took less money to come play for the Rangers than he could have gotten from the Islanders. So I'm not even going to say Panarin is overpaid. But, without going through the entire roster here and spending the entire episode on that, I do think $8 million a year for Jacob Trouba might be a little bit too much. And the Rangers, and specifically Jeff Gorton, they not only gave him $8 million a year when they signed him to that extension, but they also included a full no-move clause for seasons 2 through 5. The Rangers, they give out no-move clauses like it's Halloween and they're giving out candy. And I know, that's all part of these negotiations, and some of these players, they will prioritize a no-move clause over just a little bit more money. And again, the salary cap is very tight. You have to manage it very carefully. So I get all that. The no-move clauses, are a way to save a little bit of money. But were the Raiders really in a spot where they needed to give Jacob Trouba $8 million and the full no-move clause? I don't know. I mean, they probably figured they would never look to trade Jacob Trouba, and I'm going to explain why in just a little bit here. Or if they did trade Jacob Trouba, they would do it in the last 2 years of his contract when he has a limited no-move clause. More on that in a second as well. But yeah, once again, as I look up and down this roster, who's the one guy that's probably getting just a little bit more money than he should be? I would say it's Jacob Trouba. I think he stands out a little bit more than anyone else. Now, I also get the feeling this is going to be a very, very polarizing episode. I alluded to that just a second ago. Jacob Trouba, I think now that Ryan Strome is gone, you could say that Jacob Trouba, probably the most polarizing player on this New York Ranger roster. Some players, love his grit and his old school mentality, the fact that, he dishes out hits and big physical player, good leader, all that good stuff. And then there's people that think that he just does not play like an $8 million defenseman, at least not on a consistent basis. Some people were really unhappy with the way he played in the playoffs, specifically the Tampa series, and even more specifically, Game 3 of the Tampa series, when he took basically 3 straight penalties, allowed Tampa to get back into that game and basically take over the series. And then, of course, in Game 6, he gets burned right after the Rangers tied the game. Trouba gets burned by Steven Stamkos. Stamkos goes in alone and scores and makes it 2-1 Tampa. So a lot of people were unhappy with Jacob Trouba for that reason as well. He is a polarizing player. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not throwing out the idea of a Jacob Trouba trade because I think that Trouba is just awful and can't play hockey. Far from it. I just mentioned all these things a second ago, but again, I think he's a rock-solid, tone-setting defenseman. Has he always been someone who's been worth $8 million a year? I would also have to say no to that. And this is coming from someone who has been more of a Trouba supporter than I think most Ranger fans have been. I definitely appreciate that old school style. There's a game earlier this year in the regular season. He had a big game. I can't remember even who they were playing or what his final stat line was, but he was hitting people all night. I think he had a goal in this game. And then at the end of the game, the Rangers had it well in hand. They were going to win. And somebody basically, sucker punched Trouba. They still had their glove on, but they sucker punched him. And Trouba at that point, hey, I'm throwing my gloves down and we're going. He threw his gloves down to the ice, started, dishing out punches and had to be separated and, pulled away by the officials. And I remember I did the episode after that game and I came on here and I was like, how do Ranger fans not like this guy? He just had a whale of a game. And again, brings that old school, hard-nosed style of play that Ranger fans seem to love, and yet some of those same Ranger fans do not like Jacob Trouba. They can't stand him. They don't want him on this team. It's not that I can't stand him. It's not that I think he's a bad defenseman or he can't play hockey. It's just that I'm looking at this from a very practical standpoint. Okay, what's a good way that the Rangers could free up some money and not have it absolutely kill them? And, you look at the no-move clauses up and down this roster. It's hard to come up with pretty much anybody, but I think Jacob Trouba in 2 years is probably going to fit the bill for that. I even wonder sometimes if the Rangers actually, if the no-move clause didn't exist right now, if it wasn't still in effect for Jacob Trouba, if the Rangers might have actually considered trading him as soon as this current offseason that we're going to, heading into free agency, heading into the draft, whatever it might be. I mean, they obviously wouldn't do it now because it wouldn't really benefit them. It would benefit them more heading into free agency. But nevertheless, I think it's an interesting question. And now that I've kind of set the framework here and kind of stated the positives and negatives for Jacob Trouba, we're going to discuss if the Rangers would have indeed traded Jacob Trouba this offseason had it been an opportunity for them and had that no-move clause not existed. And we will also talk about, once again, if and when he will be traded by the Rangers at some point in the future, and why I think that's more likely than not to happen, that he'll be traded before the end of this 7-year contract occurs. And we'll get to all that good stuff in just a second. But first, I just want to let everybody know, today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by BetOnline.net. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. And I'm going to continue talking about Jacob Trouba and the concept of the Rangers, eventually trading him, and if they would have even maybe done it this offseason, if that had been an option that was on the table for the Rangers. As a quick aside here, we're going to take a quick detour and also mention that Chris Kreider is somebody else that you could make a case for in 2 years. Might be somebody to be traded, whether it's Kreider or Trouba. Maybe trading one or the other would open up some cap space. I would not trade Chris Kreider. Let me just get that out of the way real quick here. But as far as Chris Kreider is concerned, he also has a full no-move clause until 2024-2025, same as Jacob Trouba. He then has a 15-team no-trade list for the final 3 seasons of his contract. So Kreider's contract runs 1 season longer than does Jacob Trouba's. And I'll at least acknowledge that if the Rangers are desperate for cap space, then Kreider also could be a candidate to be moved, since he once again carries a cap hit of $6.5 million per season. But again, he's coming off a 52-goal season. He's the elder statesman of the Rangers. He's a leader in the locker room. I know Trouba's a leader too, but Chris Kreider's been there a little bit longer. Might even be in line to be the next Ranger captain. That's a different topic for a different episode this offseason. But I still think between Trouba and Kreider, Trouba would probably be the one that it would make more sense to trade in 2 years when both of their no-move clauses are gone. And not gone, but they'll both be limited no-move clauses. And at that point, you would be able to choose from about half the league as far as teams that you can negotiate a deal with as it pertains to either Kreider or Trouba. And again, Kreider also makes a little bit less money than Jacob Trouba. Kreider's at $6.5 million per season. Trouba is at $8 million per season. So an interesting question that I alluded to just a second ago, and I want to propose it to you guys right here, right now. Be curious to see what you guys think, because I think this is going to be a very lively comment section on YouTube. And now I might say that, and there'll be like one comment, but the comment section has kind of been picking up recently as far as Locked On New York Rangers episodes are concerned, and that's awesome. It's always so good to get some feedback from you guys and kind of get some varying opinions on, whatever we might be talking about on this podcast. But again, Trouba, very, very polarizing. I get the feeling a lot of people are definitely going to, have an opinion one way or the other on this. But again, the question that I propose to everybody listening to this: would the Rangers trade Jacob Trouba, right now if they could? Or more specifically, I guess about a month ago, heading in to free agency, because you would want to do that before free agency starts, and then you have more money to play with. You got more money at your disposal to do whatever you want to do in free agency. And it's tough to say, because the Rangers, they seem to have mostly done the things that they wanted to do this offseason. They traded Alex Georgiev. They got their guy in Vincent Trocheck in free agency. You got to figure a new Capo Caco deal is coming sooner rather than later. So it's not like the Rangers were completely handcuffed this offseason and couldn't do any of the things that they wanted to do. But then again, if they had been able, let's just say hypothetically, to trade Jacob Trouba, and they indeed did trade Jacob Trouba, it would have opened up, once again, $8 million in cap space and opened up basically a whole other world of possibilities. For Ranger fans that wanted to trade for Johnny Gaudreau or sign Nazem Kadri or trade for Patrick Kane, all of that would have been at least feasible if they had also been able to trade Jacob Trouba and actually, moved him, actually followed through on it and traded Jacob Trouba somewhere else. Because again, that's another $8 million in cap space to play with. I know a lot of Ranger fans, get Gaudreau, get Kadri. I never saw it. I just didn't think it could happen because there just was not enough cap space available. But there would have been enough cap space available if Trouba wasn't eating up $8 million. And again, I'm not saying this to bash Jacob Trouba. I'm just being very, very practical here. You got a defenseman on this team who's making a ton of money, and that's a position where the Rangers are really strong and could possibly withstand the loss of Jacob Trouba, and it would hurt a little bit, but it might not hurt as bad as some people might think. And again, we will get to that concept in just a second. But again, when there's names like Kadri and Gaudreau and Kane and Kachuk, all Ranger fans tossing all those names around, we discussed it on here But again, never really thought it was possible. But that trade of Jacob Trouba would have opened it up as a possibility. Now, it's also possible the Rangers trade Jacob Trouba and they're not able to land any of those players anyway because there's a lot of competition for the services of players like Tkachuk or Kadri or Gaudreau or whoever it might be. But yes, a trade of Jacob Trouba would have at least made it possible for the Rangers to land one of these true bona fide superstars this offseason. But this also kind of leads me into what I believe is the biggest reason why the Rangers might like to trade Jacob Trouba or might have liked to trade Jacob Trouba heading into this offseason if it was something that was actually possible. And it's another reason why I think, once it becomes possible to trade Jacob Trouba in 2 years, that it is pretty likely to happen. And it's a reason that not a lot of people are talking about. It's not because he took some bad penalties against Tampa. It's not because, it's partly because of his big contract, but that's not even the biggest reason. The biggest reason for me is the very simple fact that the Rangers right now are in a far different position than they were when they traded for Jacob Trouba 3 years ago and signed him to that 7-year extension worth $56 million. That happened back in 2019. At the time, the Rangers were pretty much right at the start of the massive teardown rebuild. We all know about it. They were undertaking just a complete overhaul of the entire franchise. They needed someone as sort of the centerpiece of the rebuild as it pertained to their defensemen. Much like Artemi Panarin was the centerpiece as far as the forwards are concerned for the rebuild, Jacob Trouba was brought in to be the centerpiece for the defenseman. And in some ways, he was. When he came over to the Rangers, he was only 25 years old. He was seemingly entering his prime in the NHL. Defensemen like that don't often become available, but, by all accounts, it sounded like he wanted out of Winnipeg. He wasn't going to sign long-term there. The Jets didn't really have a choice, and the Rangers strike that trade with the Jets. The Jets now becoming the Rangers, preferred trade partner, it would seem. But yeah, when Trouba came in, he was only 25 years old, but that was actually kind of veteran status compared to the other Ranger blue liners. And even now, you look at Jacob Trouba, he is the oldest Ranger defenseman under contract with this team, and he's still only 28 years old. The next oldest Ranger defenseman is Ryan Lindgren. He won't be 25 until February. And that's all assuming that you do not count Jared Tenorti, and no, we're not going to count Jared Tenorti. But when Trouba was signed by the Rangers, once again, he was going to be the top dog. He was going to be the man, the unquestioned leader of the defenseman group, and just the best all-around player, the guy that was going to come in and do it all. Well, you fast forward to this offseason, it's 3 seasons later. Jacob Trouba is about to enter, once again, his 4th season with the New York Rangers, and the dynamic of this Ranger blue line has really, really changed, and changed for the better. Let's take a look back at the other Ranger defensemen that were on this roster when the Rangers originally traded for Jacob Trouba and signed him to an extension, and then we will take a look at what the defenseman group looks like on current day here. And we'll start, once again, with the Ranger defensemen that were there in 2019-2020, which was Jacob Trouba's first season with the Rangers. Tony DeAngelo. We all know how that turned out. When Trouba was signed, DeAngelo had played just 2 seasons with the Rangers. In that time, he had 4 goals and 34 assists in 93 games, so this is before the one monster season that he had with the Rangers, and then he followed up that monster season by fighting his own goalie. The whole thing was a mess, and he was basically kicked off the team. So when Trouba was signed, DeAngelo was somebody that the Rangers had high hopes for, but he wasn't there yet, and I think Trouba was still leaps and bounds ahead of DeAngelo as far as the Rangers were concerned. Adam Fox was a member of the New York Rangers when Trouba was acquired, but he had yet to make his NHL debut. I think certainly the Rangers were high on Fox, but I don't know that anybody could have guessed that this dude was going to win the Norris Trophy at the age of 23, just his 2nd season in the league. So the Rangers didn't know what they had when it came to Adam Fox. Brady Shea was here, and to me, Brady Shea, I'm sorry, I don't have any other way to say this. I always thought he was overrated and overpaid by the New York Rangers, and he ended up getting traded at the deadline during Trouba's first season with the team, so clearly the Rangers had some reservations about Brady Shea as well, or more specifically paying him the money that they were paying him. Now, when Jacob Trouba was signed, Lindgren had played a grand total of just 5 career games with the Rangers, so clearly Ryan Lindgren, another guy, was thought to just be the throw-in in the Nash trade, and they didn't know what they had in Ryan Lindgren either. Mark Stahl was still here. I don't think we need to go into too much detail here. He was on his last legs with this team. Brendan Smith was still here, another overpaid defenseman, a third-pair guy at best, and someone who was not really going to be part of the rebuild. They were kind of just waiting until they could basically move on from Brendan Smith. He played out his contract. He did okay at times, but they were paying way too much money to Brendan Smith. And then Libor Hajek was here, and I'll be the first one to say I think Hajek gets a little bit too much hate, but he hasn't shown that he can be anything more than, average at best at the NHL level. So, All this is a way of saying Jacob Trouba was far and away expected to be the best Ranger defenseman in his first season here and well beyond. And part of the reason for that is that the rest of the Ranger defensemen were either completely unproven, guys like Fox, Lindgren, Hayek, or they were on their last legs with the team, guys like Stahl, Smith, and as it turned out, Brady Shea as well. So you look at what the Ranger defensemen looked like back then, the entire group, the entire room of defensemen, and you compare it to current day, and there is no comparison. You've got Adam Fox, who once again, a Vezina winner 2 seasons ago, and then last year finished 5th in the Vezina, one of the truly elite defensemen in this league. There's not enough good things you can say about Adam Fox. Ryan Lindgren has come in and basically played a Jacob Trouba style of game. The only difference is he's doing it for $3 million per season, whereas Jacob Trouba is doing it for $8 million per season. Lindgren has been an absolute steal. He was, again, acquired as part of the Nash trade and become a bona fide staple of this New York Ranger team, somebody that's kind of the heart and the soul of this team as well. You've got K'Andre Miller. K'Andre Miller is already a superstar. I'm saying it in present tense. There's no more talk about upside on here or potential or anything else. K'Andre Miller is the man. He is going to be an absolutely phenomenal player in this league. Mark my words. So 3 big-time defensemen, and then Braden Schneider, you could throw him in there as well. He, for a rookie last season, I thought played very well, hit himself very nicely in the playoffs, has, two-way defenseman ability, throws his weight around. Good, strong, young defenseman for the Rangers to build around. And then you come to the group of prospects. Zac Jones, Nils Lundqvist, Matthew Robertson, Hunter Skinner, the newly acquired Ty Emberson. The list just goes on and on and on. And a lot of these guys are pretty much NHL ready, at least if you go by, what people are saying about them. Jones and Lundqvist, of course, have already made their NHL debuts. Maybe we see Matthew Robertson or Hunter Skinner get a chance this season as well. So we're basically now at the point where, once again, 3 years ago, Trouba's brought in. It's looking like he's going to be the guy to lead the Ranger defenseman and the best defenseman on the team. We're at the point with Trouba just 3 years later. I think you can honestly make the point where Jacob Trouba, at this point, is now only the 4th best defenseman on the Rangers. I would put Fox, Lindgren, and Miller all ahead of him. I'm not going to say that that's an undeniable, undisputable fact, but I think you can make that case that there are 3 guys that have actually eclipsed Jacob Trouba since he's gotten here to the Rangers, and I think I personally would make that case. I would put the other 3 ahead of Jacob Trouba right now. And again, there's a lot of young prospects coming along, guys that are going to be playing on ELCs or even still are playing on ELCs, like Miller and Schneider, who, maybe in the case of Schneider and maybe in the case of some of these other guys, Jones or Lundqvist or whoever it might be, they're not at Jacob Trouba's level yet, but they have tremendous upside, and they're making $925K a year, where Jacob Trouba is making $8 million a year. So the Rangers, in a nutshell, have basically gotten to a point where Jacob Trouba, and I'm not trying to kill Trouba because I like Trouba, and you know what? You might hear all this and say, well, who cares if the Ranger defensemen have, gotten better around Trouba? Let's have that luxury. Let's have a lot of excellent defensemen on this team. It's a fine point to make, but I do think that with the emergence of so many other young Ranger defensemen and with so many players that have a chance to really take that next step and really become big-time players for this Ranger team, Jacob Trouba is not nearly as important to the Rangers now as he was 3 years ago. And again, I cannot emphasize enough, none of this is meant to be an attack on Jacob Trouba. I know there's some fans, as I mentioned, still upset with him for how he played in the playoffs. I definitely get that. But the question needs to be proposed. If it was not for Jacob Trouba having the full no-move clause, would the Rangers have traded him at the start of this offseason? And would they have been able to make themselves a better team by doing so? I would say yes to both of those questions, because if you move Trouba for, say, a draft pick, I mean, you're gonna get a pretty high draft pick for Jacob Trouba. I would think second round at worst. I think probably maybe even a first rounder. Probably a first rounder for Jacob Trouba. And then, on top of that, you've cleared $8 million in cap space, and you can go out and get one of those free agents that I was talking about a little bit earlier in the episode. And yes, it would hurt your defenseman group, but it seems like there's guys ready to step into that role. It doesn't come without risk, but to move Trouba and his $8 million and bring in a superstar forward and then roll with the defenseman, the established defenseman that you already have, plus a couple of young up-and-comers, I think that's a move, it's a series of moves that makes the Rangers a little bit better. And by all accounts, once again, Jacob Trouba, great leader in the locker room, has had a positive influence on K'Andre Miller. That's been a really fun pairing for the Rangers these last few years between Trouba and Miller. But again, we're looking at a situation where it is going to become more and more difficult to manage the salary cap. I don't want to see the Rangers have to trade somebody like Ryan Lindgren, who's only making $3 million a season, just to open up a little bit of cap space. I don't want to see the Rangers be unable to afford to eventually sign K'Andre Miller to a long-term extension, because you guys know how I feel about him. I think the sky is the absolute limit for K'Andre Miller. So I do think a trade of Trouba is something that the Rangers would have explored this offseason if not for the no-move clause. And once the clause becomes modified 2 offseasons from now, and Trouba's in a spot where he can only block a trade to 15 teams, I think it's entirely possible that the Rangers will indeed at that time trade Jacob Trouba, and not because they don't like him or don't think he could play hockey, but to open up that cap space to do a couple of other things, to open up a little bit of flexibility for this team. And hopefully by then, Fox, Lindgren, Miller, they're all superstars. They're all continuing their ascent. Hopefully Braden Schneider is a star by then. And hopefully some of the prospects, again, Jones, Lundqvist, Robertson, Skinner, Emberson, whoever it might be, hopefully one or more of those guys is working out nicely. And at that point, Trouba becomes even just a little bit more expendable for the Rangers. And I do think at that point, at the very latest, 2 off seasons from now, you're probably going to see Jacob Trouba get traded. And I don't say that lightly, because there's no guarantee. He could be the Ranger captain by then, and they might still love him in the locker room, and he might be here to stay. That's entirely possible, but I also think it's possible that the Rangers will say, okay, we need some cap space. Who that's making a good amount of money is the most expendable? And I do think at that point the answer will be Jacob Trouba. And as I mentioned in the intro today, we're going to wrap up today's episode by putting the draft spotlight at Mr. Bryce McConnell-Barker. He went number 97 overall to the New York Rangers in this year's draft, and we will do that in just a second. All right, we're going to go ahead and turn our attention to Draft Spotlight. And once again, this is an off-season series where we, one by one, take a look at all 6 members of the Rangers draft class of 2022. We already covered Adam Sikora. We did that back in episode 635. You can head there to get my thoughts on Sikora. Today, however, we turn our focus once again to the Rangers' second pick of the draft. That was 18-year-old Bryce McConnell-Barker, whom the Rangers selected with the final pick of the 3rd round. McConnell-Barker went number 97 overall. And I should point out real quick before we talk about McConnell-Barker, this was the selection that would not have been possible without the trade of Alex Georgiev. The Rangers dealt Georgie to the Avalanche in exchange for 2 third-rounders and a 5th-rounder, and this is one of those thirds which originally belonged to the Colorado Avalanche. So turn our attention once again to McConnell-Barker, 6'1", 187 pounds, lefty shot. Almost everyone had him ranked better than number 97, which is where the Rangers got him. You look at Bob McKenzie, he had him at number 43. Dollar Prospects had him at number 58. Matthew Zator had him at number 50. Peter Baracchini had him at number 44. Andrew Forbes had him at number 53. These are just a couple of examples, but the general consensus is that, at least going by these rankings, Bryce McConnell-Barker will be gone long before number 97. And it's interesting because I actually spotlighted McConnell-Barker during the lead up to the draft. I thought he would be gone too. Every year, I really try to focus in on the Rangers' first selection and throw out a few names as far as who they could take, who might be a good fit. And this year, that would have been the 2nd round pick that they used to take Sikora. But I threw out McConnell-Barker's name, and as it turned out, hey, he was still available in the 3rd round. So he slipped just a bit down the rankings, down the board, and the Rangers might have gotten a steal here. For starters, I like the fact that the Rangers drafted a center after taking Sikora, a left winger, with their first pick. To me, the Rangers right now are thinnest at center and right wing, and I know some people don't think you should draft from a positional need, and I get that. I definitely understand that viewpoint. You just take the best player available. But when you look at the Rangers right now, they just look so much deeper at defenseman and left wing than they do at center or at right wing. And I think for those reasons, there's enough of a difference there where drafting based on positional need isn't always a bad idea. On top of that, you can never have too many centers. They're always in high demand around this league. Chris Drury tends to play things pretty close to the vest, but he has talked pretty openly about the need for drafting strong centers, and the Rangers seem like they got a good one here. McConnell-Barker played in the OHL last season with the Sioux Greyhounds, and he actually missed a year of hockey due to the OHL canceling its 2020-2021 season. That was going to be his first season in the OHL. Instead, he ends up making his debut this past year, skates in 68 games, 23 goals, 26 assists for 49 points. He was also a +1. And then in the playoffs, played in 10 games, scored 1 goal, picked up 4 assists, and was also a -1. And then his Greyhounds actually lost in the 2nd round of the playoffs to Brandon Offman's Flint Firebirds in 5 games. But he apparently did a lot of this while playing on the 3rd line, all these impressive offensive numbers. He was not in a top 6 role for the Greyhounds. The Greyhounds have a couple of other guys that have been drafted that are playing ahead of him on the Greyhounds, and so top 6 minutes were limited for McConnell-Barker, at least for parts of the season. But he's got a reputation as just a good all-around two-way center, a strong work ethic, very, very competitive, solid speed, Good shot, high hockey IQ, that's always nice. Doesn't make a lot of mistakes. Good on the back check, good defensive center as well. Takes away passing lanes very nicely as well. As far as a knock on him, apparently a little bit inconsistent, especially when it comes to offense, but he is considered to have a very high ceiling. And when you can get somebody with a very high ceiling with the final pick of the third round, that sounds pretty good to me. I really like this pick for the New York Rangers. I think eventually, sooner or later, we will see McConnell-Barker. Probably not this season, but sooner or later, we will see McConnell-Barker skating in some games with the New York Rangers. And I'll leave you guys with a couple of prospects because these are the guys that do this for a living and watch these players very, very closely. This one comes to us from Elite Prospects. The centerman's supporting game is his biggest asset. He's the link between all of his teammates' plays, a predictable and timely ally on the ice, offensively and defensively. He understands the shutdown game, the necessity to balance pressure and effort with sound positioning, to remove options from the opposition, and limit the time spent running around the defensive zone. Then we have one from Joseph Along of FC Hockey. Joseph doesn't seem to be the biggest fan, but I figure we can also mix in a negative review here just to get the counter viewpoint, so to speak. So this is what he had to say. While his physicality and battle level aren't areas of concern, like some other similarly ranked OHL prospects, his inconsistent production and a lack of creativity in his offensive zone approach to get more looks in high-danger areas may limit his ultimate NHL upside as a two-way center. And then we'll end on a positive one here. This one comes to us from the Sioux Greyhounds themselves, the OHL Priority Selection Guide. Bryce is a tall and lengthy center that has a presence each and every time he is on the ice. He is a good skater with good overall quickness. He has good offensive skills and instincts that he used to generate a lot of his team's offense this past season. He is always moving and putting pressure on the puck and is a tireless worker both with and without the puck. He has all the attributes to be a very good player moving forward. And yeah, I figure we could pretty much call it there for today. The other bit of news that I have to make mention of here is that beginning this week, Locked On, all the NHL podcasts are going to be moving from 5 days a week to 3 days a week. I should also mention this is only temporary. My understanding is that this will continue for about 7 weeks. Locked On does this with all of its sports. Once it gets into, deep into the off season, they will knock it down to 3 episodes per week for, every single sport. And we're entering that time period with the NHL right now. So it's just going to be 3 episodes per week. But don't think for a second we're slowing down on here. There's still a ton of things that I want to get to and talk about before this next season starts. And there might even be some weeks where we do more than 3 episodes. I definitely don't rule that out. So we'll see how it goes, but definitely stick with Locked On New York Rangers. There might be a couple less episodes per week, but we're still going to be going pedal to the metal here and getting everybody ready and excited for this upcoming season. But that will do it for today, guys. Once again, if you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. And definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that is @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely make sure you subscribe to the Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. There are some things on there that are YouTube exclusive. Thanks again, guys. I'll see you next time. Thanks for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. In our next episode, we're going to be talking with Mr. Jack Bushman of Locked On Chicago Blackhawks. I believe this will be our first crossover with Jack. We're going to discuss Patrick Kane trade rumors, as well as get to know Ryan Carpenter a little bit better. Ryan Carpenter, of course, signed by the Rangers in free agency, and he spent parts of all the last 3 seasons with the Chicago Blackhawks, so nobody better than Jack Bushman to bring in here. Help us get to know Ryan Carpenter a little bit better. Now make your second listen Locked On NHL. Locked On experts give you a daily 30-minute podcast on all things NHL all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast.